This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Lightly. Finally. What is it now? Speak, fool. Ah, at last. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. Tread lightly. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostborn hungers.
Our allied town is being attacked!
At last. Frostborn hungers. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. What is it now? Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last.
Point the way.
Finally. This is more like it.
Our allied
Finally.
town is being attacked!
No one orders me around. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it.
Point the way.
Speak, fool. What is it now? Finally. Ah, at last.
Point the way.
No one orders me around.
Point the
Tread
way.
lightly. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last.
Point the way.
What is it now? Finally.
We're under attack!
At last.
Point the way.
Tread lightly. Speak, fool. This is more like it. What is it now? Finally. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. Ah, at last. Finally. Ah,
Our
at
allied
last.
town is being attacked!
No one orders me. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread
We're
lightly.
under attack!
Ah, at last. I'll make sure you suffer. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Your pain shall be legendary. You will know endless torment.
Our allied town is
Your
being
pain shall
attacked!
be legendary. Ah, at last.
Greetings, friend.
Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. No one
Our
orders
allied
me
hero has
around.
been slain!
Tread lightly. Speak, fool. Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. What is it now? No one orders me around. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last.
Under attack!
Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. Ah, at last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. Speak, fool. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. Ah, at last. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. What is it now? This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. This is more like
Our
it.
allied town is being attacked.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hunger.
Hello there.
We're under
Speak,
attack.
Tread lightly. What is it now? Finally. This is more like it. No one orders me around. What is it now? Finally. No one orders me around.
Our allied town is
Frostmourne
being attacked.
At last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Now Frostmourne. This is more like it.
Our allied hero has been slain.
At last. This is more like it. At last. No one orders me around. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Finally.
Our allied town
This
is being
more
attacked.
like it. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Glory to the Scourge. This is more like it. Finally.
We're under attack.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. Faithless coward.
Our
This is
allied
more
town
like
is
it.
being attacked.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Speak, fool. At last. No one orders me around.
Our allied town is being
Frostmourne
attacked.
hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it.
Our
Frostmourne
allied town
hungers.
is being attacked.
At last.
Welcome to our village.
Speak, fool. No one orders me around. What is it now?
Our allied hero has been slain.
No one orders me around.
Point the way.
Our allied town is being
What is it
attacked.
now? No one orders me around. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. You will know endless torment. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. Finally. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. What is it now? Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? Tread lightly. Finally. last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? At last. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it.
Our hero has been slain.
What is it now? At last. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Inventory is full.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it.
You will know endless torment.
At last.
Our
This
allied
is
town
more
is
like
being
it.
attacked.
At last. For the Lich King. Finally. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Speak, fool. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Tread lightly. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly.
Our allied town
No
is
one
being
orders
attacked.
me around. At last. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? Speak, fool. What is it now? At last. Frostmourne hungers.
Our allied town is being
At
attacked.
last. Tread lightly. What is it now? Finally.
Our allied town is being attacked.
No one orders me around. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it.
We're under attack.
Frostmourne hungers.
Our allied hero has been slain.
You will not get this. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Our allied town is being
Frostmourne
attacked.
hungers. Finally.
We're under
Frostmourne
attack.
hungers. At last.
Our allies' hero has been
Frostmourne
slain.
hungers. Finally.
Our allied town
This
is
is
being
more
attacked.
Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Our allied town is being town is being attacked!
Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. Ah, at last.
Our allies' hero has been slain!
This is more like it. Finally. Ah, at last. What is it now? Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Ah, at last. No one orders me around. Tread lightly. What is it now? No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. For the Lich King. This is more like it.
Your pain has been laid.
Finally. This is more like it. Ah,
Our
at
allies'
last.
hero has been
This
slain!
is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Faithless coward. Ah, at last. Finally. Ah, at
Hello
last.
there.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? This is more like it. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allied town
Frostmourne
is being
hungers.
attacked!
This is more like it. Finally. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers.
Our hero has been slain! Our allies' hero has been slain!
Is it now? Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last.
Our allied town is
Tread
being
lightly.
attacked!
Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Speak, fool.
Our allied town is being
No one
attacked!
orders me around. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last.
Our
Finally.
allied town is being attacked!
Ah, at last. Finally.
Our allied
This is
hero
more
has been
like it.
slain!
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last.
Our allied town is being attacked!
What is it now? At last. Finally. Frostborn.
Our allied town is being attacked!
Lightly. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Now, Frostborn. No one orders me around. Finally. Now, Frostborn. Oh, for the Lich King. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. What is it? Speak, fool. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more like it.
Your our allied hero has been slain!
Frostborn hungers. At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allied hero has
At
been
last.
slain!
Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last.
Our hero has been slain! Our allied town is being attacked! Our allied town is being attacked!
Speak, fool. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Tread lightly. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me around. At last. Frostborn hungers. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. At last. This is more
Our
like
allied
it.
town is being attacked!
At last. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostborn hungers. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally.
Our
At
allied
last.
town is being attacked!
Frostborn hungers. This is more like it. At last. Speak, fool. Finally. Frostborn hungers. Finally. Frostborn hungers. No one orders me. At last. Finally. What is it now? At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostborn hungers. Finally. At last. No one
Our
orders
allied
me
town
around.
is being attacked!
Tread lightly. No one orders This is more like it. This is more like it. What is it? At last. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it.
Our allied town
Frostmourne
is being
hungers.
attacked.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Speak,
Our allied
fool.
town is being attacked.
Tread lightly.
Our
Frostmourne
allies' hero
hungers.
has been slain.
At last. Now, Frostmourne. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. No one orders me around. This is more like it.
Our
Frostmourne
allies' hero has
hungers.
been slain.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. Now, Frostmourne. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. Tread lightly. What
We're
is it?
under attack.
At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our allies' hero has
No
been
one
slain.
orders me around. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last.
Our
Frostmourne
allies' hero has
hungers.
been slain. Our allied
At
town
last.
is being attacked.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Our allied town is being attacked.
At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. What is it now? Tread lightly.
Our allied town is being attacked.
This is more like it. What is it now? Speak, fool. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our
What
allied
is it
town
now?
is being attacked.
Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. At last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. For the Lich King. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more. What is it now? At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne
Our
hungers.
allied town is being
At
attacked.
last. This is more like it.
Our allied town is being attacked. Our allies' hero has been slain.
Speak, fool. Finally. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. No one orders me around. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally.
Your pain will be legendary. You will know endlessly.
Tread lightly. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Tread lightly. At last. This is more like it.
Our allied town
at
is being
last.
attacked.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. For the Lich
Our
King.
allied hero has been slain.
This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally.
Your pain shall be legendary.
Now. This is more like it. At last.
Our allied town is being attacked.
This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. What is it now? Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it. At last.
Our allied town is being attacked.
Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. No one orders me around. Tread lightly. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Finally. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last.
Our allied
Finally.
town is being attacked. Our allies
At
hero has
last.
been slain.
Tread lightly. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our allied town is being
No
attacked.
one orders me around. For the Lich King.
We're under attack.
Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. At last.
Our allied town is
Frostmourne
being
hungers.
attacked.
At last. Finally. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Our
No one
allied town
orders
is
me
being
around.
attacked.
This is more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Glory to the Scourge.
Our allied town is being attacked. Our allied town is being attacked. town is
No
being
one
attacked.
orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Finally. Ah, at last. What is it now? This is more like it. Ah, at last.
Faithless.
Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne. Tread lightly. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Ah, at last. Finally.
Your pain becomes legendary.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Finally.
Our allied town is being
Frostmourne
attacked.
hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Finally. This is more like it. Ah, at last.
Our allied town is being attacked.
This is more like it. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Our
Ah,
allied
at
town
last.
is being attacked.
Finally. Ah, at last. Finally. What is it now? Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Ah, at last.
Our
Speak,
allied town
fool.
is being attacked.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Ah, at last.
Our allied town is being attacked.
This is more like it. Ah, at last. Finally.
Our allied town has been slain. End this war.
This is more like it.
Our allied town is being attacked. Has been slain. Our allied town is being attacked. Our allied town is being attacked. Our allied town is being attacked. Our allied town is being attacked.
No one orders me around. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. Ah, at last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Ah, at last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Our allied town is being attacked.
Ah, at last. Finally. This is more. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers.
Our allies' hero has
Finally.
been slain.
This is
Our
more
allied
like
town is being
it.
attacked.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. What is it now? Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. This is more like it. At last.
Our
Frostmourne
allied town is
hungers.
being attacked.
Tread lightly. At last. Speak, fool. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allied
Finally.
town is being attacked.
Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Glory to the Scourge. We're under attack. This coward. Our allied town is being
Frostmourne
attacked.
hungers. At last. Frostmourne
Our
hungers.
allied hero has been
This is
slain.
more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Greetings, friend.
No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. This is more like it. For the Lich King. Now. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally.
No end to this event.
At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally.
Our allies' hero has been slain.
At last. Finally. At last. Finally. For the Lich King. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Your pain shall be legendary.
At last. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King. At last. This is more like it. What is it now? At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Glory to the Scourge.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally. What is it now? Tread lightly. Speak, fool. This is more like
Hello
it.
there.
Our allies'
Greetings,
hero has been
No one
slain.
orders me around. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Our allied town is being
At
attacked.
last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This
Our
is more
allied town is being attacked.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers.
Our allied
Finally.
town is being attacked.
Tread lightly. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last.
Our allied town is being attacked.
Finally. At last. Frostmourne. What is it now? Finally. No
Our
one
allied
orders
town
me
is
around.
being attacked.
What is it now? Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
Our
Finally.
allied town is being attacked.
Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it.
Our allied town is being attacked.
At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allied hero has been
Frostmourne
slain.
hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now?
Our allied
Speak,
town is
fool.
being attacked.
No one orders me around. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it.
Our allied town is
Frostmourne
being
hungers.
attacked.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Our allies' hero has been
Frostmourne
slain.
hungers. Finally. At last. This is more like it.
Our allied town is
At
being
last.
attacked.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. What is it now?
Our allied town is
At
being
last.
attacked.
Finally. Frostmourne hungers. For the Lich King.
Not enough.
Finally.
Glory to the Scourge.
At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally.
Our allied town is
This
being
is more
attacked.
At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it.
Our allied town is being attacked.
Tread lightly. Finally.
Our allies' hero has
At
been
last.
slain.
Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. No one wants me. Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Tread lightly. What is it now? At last. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. At last. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. No one orders me around. What is it now?
Our allies' hero has been
Frostmourne
slain.
hungers. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Our allied town is
Finally.
being attacked.
This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. At last. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hunger. No one orders me around. At last, Frostmourne hungers. Finally, this is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers.
You will end this war. Your pain is legendary.
Glory to the scourge.
I'll make sure.
Finally. This is more like it. Finally. Tread lightly. At last. Frostmourne hungers.
We're under
What is it
attack!
now? Finally. Now, Frostmourne. This is more like it. Frostmourne
Our
hungers.
allied town is being
At
attacked!
last. Finally. Speak, fool.
Welcome to our village.
Tread lightly. This is
Greetings,
more
friend.
like it.
Inventory is
Finally.
full.
Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. No one orders me around. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. What is it now? At last. Finally. At last. No one orders me around. Frostmourne
Hello there.
hungers. Finally. Speak, fool. No one orders me around. At last. What is it now? This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. This is more like it.
Our
Frostmourne
allied hero has
hungers.
been slain.
At last. Speak, fool. Finally. Frostmourne
Our allied
hungers.
hero has been slain. Our hero has been slain.
last. This is more like it. Is it now?
Our allies'
at
hero has
last.
been slain.
No one orders me around.
Our allies' hero has
Finally.
been slain.
At last. Tread lightly. Frostmourne hungers. Speak, fool. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. What is it now? At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
Our allied town is being attacked.
Speak, fool. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. At last. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Finally.
Our allied town is being
This is
attacked.
more like it. Finally. At last. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Tread lightly. Finally. At last. Frostmourne hungers. This is more
Faithless coward.
Finally. This is more like it. Frostmourne hungers. Finally. Frostmourne hungers. At last. This is more like it.
Glory to the scourge.
Our allied hero has been slain.
Speak, fool. Finally. This is more like it. At last. Frostmourne hungers. At last. Lightly. This is more like it.